John, I'm going to say, I think maybe we record for like the intro bit of this, but once we get to audience Q&A, I suspect folks would rather have it not recorded.
Okay.
I don't know how folks feel about that, but that'd be my...
I'm indifferent. I
Me
mean,
too.
it's too late now.
Indifferent.
My career.
Indifferent.
I'm committed.
Okay.
Damage has been done.
Okay. Okay.
You mean I gotta retire? Damn, damn.
I know.
Anaconda, if you
All
could
right,
put
then.
your name in the chat.
I try to be careful about recording stuff on some of this, just so that folks don't feel like they need to censor the kinds of questions that they'd want to ask, for example. So if people are okay with it, that's fine. Thank you everyone for coming. This is a delightful turnout, frankly. So just by way of kind of introduction and preamble, my name's Allison Rank. I'm chair of the Department of Politics, and I'm kind of unofficially coordinating a lot of the civic engagement work on campus. When we were trying with the Civic Engagement Coalition to think about professional development for faculty and staff around the 2024 election, I thought that it might be a good idea to have some sort of official conversation about academic freedom, which is something that at least for me, I don't remember really having conversations about on this campus in particular. I pay a lot of attention to it in like the Chronicle and other spaces, but I thought it'd be worth kind of having a conversation. And so to that end, I thought having Scott out of the provost's office for obvious reasons, and then somebody from UUP, which Liz has graciously agreed to be here, made sense as sort of the folks to have in the room. So I have just a couple of really broad kind of questions about academic freedom, so that folks can kind of share their views and their perspectives, given their respective positions on campus. And I'm hoping this will be more of a sort of Q&A conversation for things folks would be interested in hearing more about from sort of our campus perspective, from administration, and then SUNY and UUP's perspective. Scott and Liz, you guys want to do quick introductions, and then we'll get underway?
Scott Furlong, Provost, Vice President for Academic Affairs, political scientist by discipline.
Liz Schmitt, Professor of Economics, and I'm here in my role as the Vice President of Academics for the Oswego chapter of UUP.
All right, thank you. And my car keys have returned. So the first question that I just wanted to throw out is if folks would chat a bit about what is the role of academic freedom in a modern university?
Nice, easy starting question.
Narrow, specific, tailored. Thanks for that.
You want to start?
No, I'll just it's now more important than ever, I think, in the role of academic freedom at universities. Particularly, I think it's a privilege and a responsibility and a necessity in a democracy. Particularly, we speak from the perspective of a public university, most of us having spent almost our whole careers at the public university, right? And so the public university, even recognized in court precedent, is almost really as an arm of government, right? That academic freedom is an important and essential Venn diagram with our First Amendment rights in terms of that. But in terms of academic freedom, it's about recognizing expertise and the ability to explore that expertise. And it's more important than ever. When people think you can teach US history without teaching about slavery and anti-Black racism, right? Academic freedom becomes more important than ever. And the recognition that the full subject truth in the history course is really important. But it's also this responsibility. So I think faculty also have to remember when they think it's sort of their domain and they're willing to venture out on a soapbox that's not related to their subject, how they really do damage to academic freedom, the university, and potentially the future of democracy in this nation.
I'll echo all of that. I don't think we in academia always recognize the importance of academic freedom until it starts getting chiseled away. And we can look at some states in the nation now, Florida, where there's real some significant issues regarding what's happening in the classroom, who controls the curriculum, who controls what's being taught within a disciplinary perspective. The history or a lot of the background of academic freedom was really a lot of it was related to research and what you were teaching, and it provided protections to really delve into difficult issues or perhaps controversial issues, and to really engage in some of those really difficult questions, and again, as our role as faculty to bring those difficult issues and discussions back to the classroom. So when that's taken away, it is, or when it is chiseled at, it does raise concerns, for me, as we think about the academy.
I think there's, as I was kind of thinking through questions for this, I think there's kind of two directions that academic freedom debates are headed. One is the kind of what's happening in Florida and sort of chiseling away at the ability to have conversations. And I want to start with kind of that conversation. And then I think we'll slide into some questions about the way that institutions are or aren't protecting academic freedom for individual academics. To stick with the kind of teaching question, I was wondering if you would both reflect a little bit on how, for faculty who are interested in teaching content germane to sort of civic inquiry, political inquiry, but not in social science fields, but where the expertise is absolutely relevant to kind of important civic questions, how does that connect into academic freedom protections?
Well, I'll start on this one. For me, and I'm cheating a little bit, and I think, Allison, this. I have some really strong perspectives around engagement with our students, and I think sometimes the using civic inquiry, civic topics within a course, even if that course is not a social science course or a humanities course or whatever we're talking about, is a way of engaging students for the why. Why are we looking at these issues, particularly for college students or new college students who have never really engaged in a topic or a discipline before, or particularly at a college level. So again, my simplistic example for on this would be, why should, for example, a social scientist, an economist, a biologist, less so for a meteorologist, talk about global warming, okay, or climate change. Okay, well, it's really easy to make that from a meteorologist perspective and a climatologist perspective, why you want to talk about that in your coursework. It's less so perhaps in economics. You've got to make that leap, a little bit of that leap. And likewise, having a biologist talk about, I'm not going to come up with a good topic right now, something that is sort of outside of the biological field as a way of connecting a topic to student interest, I think is important to do. And again, that is, and most of you know this, my background is public policy, and I think everything's related to public policy. And you ought to be able to make those types of, why are we talking about this issue in this class, and why is it important to you on a day-to-day perspective?
Yeah, and I pick up with the why, and I think in academic freedom, it's that why can really help. For faculty shouldn't presume that students understand and make that connection. I think they have to make these connections explicit. So the biologist talks about biodiversity, the effect of climate change on biodiversity and the implications for that. And that becomes relevant. As an economist, I can actually talk about the insurance market and why insurance companies aren't actually, reinsurance is not actually taking new policies east of Interstate 95 in the United States. I wonder why. I don't wonder why. I know exactly why. And that's, and the answer is climate change, or the pricing of waterfront property and what's happened to it over the years and whether risks are being priced in. And, but even economics too, I think it's also broadly considered a decision science. And so I'm always telling students will make really important decisions throughout their life. And what method are they doing? And what method are they using to do that? And so that can bring in a range of topics. But I think you have to be careful. Students make assumptions, particularly in an election year. I've gotten a bunch of things back about they just knew I was on the side of one politician or the other. Just, and I actually did a tariff example, and I was really careful to do a President Barack Obama tariff example. I think it was tires. Was it tires or iPhones or something? Tires.
On a Friday when it was
Yes.
World News Day.
Yes, it was tires, and then there was a very powerful study about basically it was $300,000 per job saved in higher consumer prices, and and then I did use the soybean retaliation example for Chinese steel tariffs, right? But still, I got it back that you're a liberal professor indoctrinating me. So I think you can be as careful as you want and try and have these examples from sides of the political aisle. But I think students will read into things.
I think the issue of indoctrination has changed over the years too. Students, certain folks on both sides of whatever aisle you want to talk about, confuse indoctrination with critical thinking, right? And again, I think back to a number of years ago when I was teaching a class and I graded a paper and someone said, well, you don't like what I wrote because it's on one side of the political spectrum or the other. It's like, well, no, I don't like what you wrote because you didn't support what you wrote. Right. And that's a big difference, and you can agree or disagree with somebody, but if you don't have the right support for the type of, whatever the assignment is, it's quote unquote wrong or not meeting the criteria that you've set, for the class, which is really, a different issue, so talking about different trade, tariff issues, whether it's one side or the other or both sides, it sounds like you're trying to be careful in this case to provide multiple, it's not really about indoctrination. At some point we are following the theories that we were brought up with, in your case, economic theory, and based on what you have learned and what you have studied in your life, this is what we expect to happen. It's not an ideological argument, right? It's, in your case, an economic argument.
So what about, I feel like those are, they're well taken examples, but I think they're also examples where if they made it to like a chair's desk, it'd be really easy to kind of make a choice and defend them. I think I start thinking about things like the case in Hamline from a couple of years ago, right?
Yeah.
Where the art professor showed the picture that like is like a very standard kind of picture to show in an art history class, and a student sort of filed complaints, and it turned into, to my understanding, a Title VI issue. How would kind of UUP or the campus think about that kind of an instance?
Well, let me start with the UUP standpoint. So if someone comes to me at UUP, a faculty member, I owe them the duty of fair representation. So, the member comes to me and I'm the advocate, and, I can think in my head, oy vey, but that's not actually what I'm saying in my outside voice, right? So UUP would advocate for make sure this person is getting full due process, and probably work to try and minimize any kind of employment impact for a faculty member, right? And that is sort of the job of a union. So, I'm the union VPA as a member of this university and a longtime employee, right? I'm cringing on one side of my brain, but on the other brain, I'm saying you're owed full due process and protection as membership in that union. So that comes into just sort of the issue of the role of the union as an advocate. But things have come up. You use Hamline. I'll say more recently in other universities, faculty and subjects, right, nothing to do with Middle East history or culture or whatever, have been very outspoken about whether they think Israel's actions are justified or not, whether it's Palestinians are being subject to genocide in Gaza, right? What can we call it, a genocide? And so those have happened, and they have been, potentially completely unrelated to the subject at hand being taught. And those complaints have been brought forward. And even under SUNY's own definition of academic freedom, that would not really be protected in those cases.
Yeah, I don't know if I have much more to add to that. Let's be clear, the Hamline situation was not handled well. From an administrative perspective, in my humble opinion on that. And again, my memory of that case is that the professor at the time was pretty clear what they were intending to do as part of the class, and the artwork that they were showing was appropriate for the course that was being taught. It wasn't some random thing they were just bringing into the classroom. So I think there's problems, and obviously maybe not obviously, to some of us, obviously the response to that was probably a little bit over the top. I think it's difficult, to use Liz's examples, more current examples to, not difficult, but, making the appropriate connection to the class. It's one thing to teach about genocide, right? And use potential examples, real or potential ones, versus, I'm in the middle of an architecture class. I'll use that because I know we don't have architecture and I won't offend anybody. And start talking about, potential genocide that's going on, within the Middle East. That's where, the issues of freedom of speech diverge a little bit from academic freedom.
I mean, they also diverge in interesting ways when we talk increasingly about private citizen conduct, right? There's the more salacious example of the University of Wisconsin at La Crosse. Very disappointed you didn't bring that up, where the adult activities of an administrator than tenured faculty, right, on personal time, right, became an issue. And what really became the issue is, potentially, and what we call a management confidential role in SUNY, the administrative role is not necessarily protected, but this person was a tenured professor.
Yep.
And this person was fired. More recently, I think the firing happened. And so
fired twice. He was fired twice.
Twice.
He fired as a chancellor and then fired as a professor.
Right. Yeah. So double fired. But I mean, I think the tenured professor was the more interesting question, probably, because administrators tend to serve at the pleasure of the president. But and that was this interesting intersection of, he did not bring it in. No one was arguing that it was relevant to class. And his whole argument was, this was what I'm doing on my own time. It was a perfectly legal activity. Right. And, and why should he have been fired for it? I think that's sort of a bit more interesting case. Interesting case popped up, unfortunately, with someone who calls himself an economist at the University of Indiana University, who said a lot of offensive things about IQ and relationships to race and ethnicity and things like that. And again, they happen outside the classroom. And it was interesting. The provost there wrote one of the best provost letters I've ever written about, this is why we can't do anything about it. But we could do things about it if specific students had specific complaints that they were treated differently, graded differently, treated differently in class over these beliefs that were allegedly outside of class and not impacting. And that's really the big question mark. I would note, interesting, Purchase recently rewrote their free speech policy in ways that I shall say is interesting, and I would guess are yet to be litigated from having read it. Right. But again, the whole argument is there's this sort of, well, you can do these things outside on your own personal time, and you have to say you have no affiliation with the university on social media unless it impacts. So there's idea, does it impact your job at the university? That's like, well, what does that even mean? Right. I mean, what does that even mean? I mean, that's a vague one. So hopefully someone was on a hotline to ACLU. We'll see how that goes. To be continued for the next presentation.
We're at 20 minutes, which was when I was planning on trying to open it up. So are there questions that folks would like to raise?
Did I stop the recording then?
Other folks seem to be fine with it. This might just be one of those places where I'm.
Okay. I've got a good question. So I feel like we are experiencing kind of a creeping influence of capitalist rationale in higher education, where students are consumers and our sources of funding are like investors. We're expected to show a return, and we're supposed to cater to students. And I think that it directly conflicts with the responsibility of the university as an institution to kind of hold society accountable and be unabashed in showing the truth and speaking the truth. I'm not sure there's anything we can even do about it. I think it has really gone deeply into the way people think about what universities should be doing and how they operate, and how, I think about how some faculty think about themselves as well. Is that it's changed a little bit. We're no longer here to speak truth. We're here to prepare people for jobs. And I just wonder what your thoughts are on this. Because I see it as almost an existential threat to the original idea of a university as this place of truth.
I mean, I think the corporatization of the university has its origins when I'm still an undergraduate, right? I would trace its origins back to the Reagan administration, almost really, and corporatization of many things. So that corporatization, and I feel it keenly. Writing a strategic plan, which was really a corporate kind of thing, and like constantly taking a virtual red pen, say we're not writing that because it sounds like too ROI or things like that. I'm like, nope, not happening, not on my watch. And so I think we hold each other accountable too, and sort of push back. I remember actually sitting in a chairs meeting where someone was talking about, it was really kind of about assessment and plans and goals. And then someone just shrugged and said, just the corporatization of the university. And no one was willing to say it out loud, and he just did. And then all of a sudden the floodgates were open and pushing back about, why do I have to, how do I justify the value? How do you quantify things that can't be quantified? And this is an economic concept. I think we pay a lot more attention to things that are easily quantified versus things that are not. And that pressure for metrics kind of permeates, and in some sense, our civil liberties are not easily quantified. Right.
We were sitting in and Liz, I don't remember if you were there or not, but we were, as part of the strategic planning process, we brought in a bunch of external stakeholders, superintendents, county leaders, city leaders, and sort of presented some of the directions we were going. This was probably back in January, February. And one of the comments from one of them, and I can't remember who it was now, was, well, this is all really great language, but I have no idea what it means, right? I don't know how it attaches to the day-to-day, the career development, what we're doing from an educational perspective. And it did sort of bring home to me sort of the academic ease that we sometimes speak in here, not just here within higher education, but, and how, there is this sort of need, and I would argue even more so for public regional comprehensives to be seen as relevant within their local and regional community. So it is something that we need to balance, I guess. The other thing I'll say is, Liz mentioned, a lot of this goes back to Reagan. I was in college during the first term of Reagan, and I went to a liberal arts school, so it's not a fair comparison. But as I got into my PhD, as I started studying public policy and writing in that area and in space, we often talked about higher education as a positive externality, right? And that the real externality there, the positive externality, is what is the general public getting by a more highly educated society? And this is why we invest, right? As we keep talking more and more about the private goods that are being generated by education, we lose that public sense, okay? Which is driving us more and more to this commercialization, that, students we're training students rather than educating students. We're preparing them for jobs rather than preparing them to be critical thinkers. The cabinet was in a retreat last week, talking a little bit about sort of the external environment of higher education, and how do you define or talk to a 17-year-old that if you go to college, then by the time you're 40, you're going to make this much more money. It has no relevance, to a 17, 18, 20-year-old person. But what we can do, and might have more relevance, particularly with this generation of students, is that it gives them more agency. It gives them more choices. Which to me, when I'm thinking as a purist, is a much more acceptable argument for why we educate, right? Than for money or for career or for training purposes.
I also think transparency about funding and the funding realities of higher ed are kind of important, because people, why has it gotten so much more expensive? Most people can't articulate that. And some of my colleagues can't articulate that. Again, the economists can. I can tell you, the amount of state subsidy, right? Are we state subsidized? We're state located. They've given us a geographic GPS coordinate where we exist. So, I mean, I think there's issues of funding. I mean, there's issues of expense. I mean, you could talk about how much more money we spend K through 12 and college, because we're educating a group of people that we used to give up on, right? By the force of federal law, but that's got to be a force for good, right? And so we're investing in the development of human capital of people that we're sort of given up on. And, you know, you think that has to be a good thing as well. But you're right, I'm constantly pushing it as the public good. But there is a reality, there's a responsibility, you know, particularly in Oswego, we have, you know, students who might be poor, Pell eligible students, and, you know, they need to be able to learn a living and support. And so sometimes you have to have those conversations about ROI, and field of studies have very different ROIs. And it's irresponsible not to have those conversations. Not having those conversations has people graduating from private schools in low earning fields with 6 figures of debt.
Now, I put in the chat a link to, the first one was wrong. They had changed it since I had it in my email, to a SUNY conference on education for the public good, good use, strengthening the case for public higher education. It's February 7th to 9th in Albany. The chancellor is going to be opening it, and there's some interesting speakers there. So to continue that discussion, it may be worth joining in on that.
Other
The reason I raised
questions?
it too- Oh, I'm so sorry.
He wanted to follow up.
Oh, yeah, the reason I raised it too is because I think it leads to a lot of self-censorship in what administrators and what faculty feel like they're able to actually say. And so a lot of the language that we use ends up sort of appealing to that logic of return on investment rather than necessarily appealing to the public good.
Right.
Hence
Right. Well, we just had an open house and my search for truth wasn't in there.
it.
It wasn't.
Right.
I didn't have a handout about the search for truth in economics. I had a handout about what our graduates did after graduation.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But we know,
Joking.
we know.
We know.
Right. Other folks have questions? Not, I'll throw a follow-up. Okay, so I kind of want to push on the point that Peter's making a little bit. Like, Liz, I mean, we changed our name to politics, but I'm also not talking search for truth when I'm standing at the open house, right? But in a world where like the emphasis of regional public universities is return on investment for a particular community, I become less and less convinced that my academic freedom has purchase, that it will be fully defended, right? Because at the point at which there's a trade-off between this person who seems like they're creating bad press versus the return on investment story we are trying to tell as a regional public comprehensive, I don't feel necessarily that confident about what happens next, right? And so I'm wondering if folks would be willing to probe a little bit on that.
I would say upward, like I would try to pivot the conversation, particularly at Oswego, pivoted from ROI to just upward mobility, right? And that's actually one of the chancellor's pillars in the SUNY system, is upward mobility. And this comes out in Vision 4040 and hopefully the strategic plan. It's almost done. It's almost done, people. And about the power of the regional public comprehensive to lift communities, right? And I've had a lot of time to reflect on it. My dad passed in May. He was a community college professor in the St. Louis system for over 35 years before he had retired. He'd been retired for quite some time. But you don't always know about your parents' work life. And so at the calling hours, in-streamed his faculty colleagues, because he joined in 64. And many of you know the leaps and bounds that a community college systems were growing in the heyday of the 70s. And the way he lifted communities and families out of, right, the same levels of subsistence and education. Now in the community college, was it about the search for truth and that quest for knowledge? It was not, all right? And he was a composition. You know, he taught a lot of English comp. So it was really about, you know, writing, technical writing, writing appropriate letters, you know, communicating and things like that. And so it was all kind of about, you know, community college was all about maybe the ROI and the upward mobility, but the lift of those communities and what people brought to them, really, you know, as people strolled through in the calling hours, a part of my dad's whose life I didn't really see that much as a girl suddenly became clear. And even as he went through in the 80s and the corporatization and community college as this job training force, I mean, that part was not lost.
I'm going to take that in a little different direction. In the context of preparation of students across a broad, in the broadest possible way, right? That we can talk about search for truth and finding meaning in life and all those lovely philosophical things that we think about, but in the bottom line, without getting too much into ROI, it is about preparation. It is about critical and creative thinking. It is about communication skills. There's a reason some of us argue that there is no conflict between liberal arts education and professional careerism. Sorry, they should and do work part and parcel, and that's borne out by the most successful people in industry and politics today. They're not. Most of them are not what I would say were not trained. They were educated, right? They engaged in the difficult topics and the difficult discussions, and maybe they did find their meaning, right? And did find their truth as part of that. But it's creating that that broader vision and perspective, and being able to be critical, to be empathetic, to learn about diverse perspectives in a critical way. I've often, as I watched a lot of the critical race theory discussions.
That's not what he wanted to say.
I had to hold my
Let's
tongue.
speculate.
I had to hold my
Let's
tongue
speculate.
that were going on a few years ago. I often thought to myself, okay, if I was in a position of applying for a job, for a provost position, and someone said, well, what do you think about this critical race theory thing? I mean, I truly believe this. We study a lot of theories in college and universities. No one's really argued that we should stop reading Marx, as far as I know.
Mm.
Okay, well, I mean,
Except in those states were prohibited.
well, I mean, but critical race theory is a way it's a theory. We have a lot of theories in the United States and in the world, and it helps organize thoughts. It does what theories do, right? And by the same token, with critical race theory very specifically, I mean, again, as a American government person, it would be awfully hard for me to talk about the Constitution without talking about the processes and structures that were in place and how that affected race in our country. So again, it goes back to what Liz said earlier. You can't teach history without talking about slavery and the issues of Jim Crow and civil rights and so on and so forth. It's part and parcel with what our history is about, and many histories are about. And it's what we do as we're engaging with these larger issues is really working through how we as faculty and as students and with our students are working to really understand those issues. And so it is part of what we do here. And it's not always about finding truth. It's about finding understanding.
And I think perhaps the bridge or the compromise when we look at these realities, particularly if you're educating a large amount of students without what I'd call the social or cultural capital, first gen or whatever, without that sort of in to how secret job markets work, and placing that first position is that we've actually made a commitment to this mapping. Major in whatever you want, and we have a strong support for the liberal arts at this institution, right? Still for now. And then we map that to career. How do you map that to career readiness? Co-curricular and integrated in the curriculum. How do you make sure that students have career ready skills? And that, I don't think that is giving up on a search for truth or giving up on the liberal arts. Instead, we're actually trying to protect it and protect its value and demonstrate its value. But I think students, who come from a less sophisticated, maybe poor, but just less sophisticated background need the help for that lift. They're not going to automatically find those pathways that a student at, Oberlin may already have through social connections. And so we have a special responsibility to make that connection.
So it sounds like you have to do both at an individual level.
You must do everything all the time
And at
and
an
be everything to all
institutional
people.
level, right?
Welcome,
Because
exactly.
if all you do is exercise academic freedom, it is an irritant to others. And so unless you're able to demonstrate that you're also providing an overall social benefit beyond that, it's almost like you're providing yourself with cover to be able to say some of those more uncomfortable things.
Mhm.
And we have some of the worst intergenerational income mobility we've ever seen in any country right now. And the students who we are bringing in, more diverse students and so forth, students who are Pell eligible and so forth, are more connected to the job prospects. And we can't get them here unless we show that we are going to enhance their employability. So
Absolutely.
it's a balance.
It's
So
a
you
balance.
can't give those other skills without getting students in the classroom. At one
Yeah.
point, it was just a very elite group that was going to college. And
Yeah.
we're finally moving past that.
I mean, I'm in my 29th year, and in the what was it, December of 2017, I sat in a student conduct hearing as advisor to a plaintiff. And, you know, she had to talk about how the crime committed against her was affecting her studies. And she actually just started out with the sentence, she's like, I'm poor, and I'm tired of being poor. And this is my only chance not to be poor. I never forgot it.
So all of the points are well taken. I think that they're,
But
But there's a but
Allison,
coming, Allison.
Allison is not
But-
satisfied. Okay, Allison.
yeah, right. Like I don't actually think it gets to the fundamental, like there will at some, I think that it is unrealistic to think that this campus or a campus very similar to ours in the SUNY system is not speeding towards an academic freedom case of the kind that is about enrollments versus somebody saying something that should have academic freedom protections that is in some way perceived as damaging to enrollments. And that, like, that's kind of where I think there's, it's a, like,
Are we taking bets on which
the-
campus? I got
What?
20 bucks on purchase. So are we taking bets which campus is the case in the SUNY system?
No, I mean, I think that that's true, right? Like, I think that the conversation sort of went immediately to the like, and here's all the ways that we're not gonna, that like, we shouldn't have this problem.
Mhm. I
But
mean,
I'm
this is an
not sure
interesting
that that's
question. I mean, I
correct.
wonder if the chancellor actually kind of went on record for his commitment. Actually, I'm going to say it was fall, Cornell. So it was fall of 2023. You know, different sectors get a chance to ask the chancellor a question at the UFS, at our University Faculty Senate. And the leader of the comprehensive sector came up to the microphone and said, "What are you going to do if he wins?" And you know what I'm talking about. He said, "What are we going to do if he wins in higher education?" And then the chancellor talked about the protections that might be built in New York and his commitment to certain things. And so I think it's something that he thinks about. And he actually, I mean, he doesn't get these questions in advance. They're off the fly. And he actually seemed ready for it. I was pretty impressed by his answer. And it expressed a lot of strong support in what they could do to support kind of the rights to teach things and to teach them correctly and completely. So I think some thought has gone into that. So, I mean, this is academic freedom and free speech. So we're dancing around the Venn diagram. And I would actually say, you know, certain SUNY campuses have published these policies that are really pushing it, in my opinion, about, right, what they're worried about enrollment and what certain activities are going to do, and think they have the right to limit it in a way that public universities probably do not. And how that's going to trickle down to faculty. I mean, faculty at public universities have been disciplined, right? They've been subject to employer discipline for their role in protest in the past year or so. A lot of them have been at privates, and that's a harder call.
So to the enrollment versus, let's say academic freedom, and we can have that discussion about whether it's academic freedom or freedom of speech issues. At my previous institution, I had a faculty member, actually a chair of a department, that during open houses, which you have all participated in open houses in different ways, and this was in the STEM field, would say, well, you shouldn't come here, you should go to Madison instead because their facilities are better. Okay, this is how to win friends and influence people type situation. Now, when I and the chair, well, actually I and the admissions office sort of asked him about this. He said, well, I'm just being honest with the students. They do have better facilities in Madison. Okay. But what is, we didn't punish him, but we did say we really didn't want this particular faculty member to participate in open houses anymore. I don't, is that a punishment or is that a reward?
That may have been why they did it.
Well, he did it multiple times and it finally got back to us and it was like, to the point of, saying things that affect enrollment, that affect finances, that affect operations, things that we're doing. It's difficult. The faculty member going to a rally on their own time, I mean, that's not necessarily academic freedom. That's a freedom of speech issue,
Sure.
I would argue.
But
right?
I would actually, from a union standpoint, I would say, there's clearly a hierarchy because we have contingent faculty that effectively probably do not have academic freedom, right? I mean, even in a unionized campus, contingent faculty for most cases can be non-renewed without a reason given.
Yeah.
They're not required, we're not required but to be given a reason.
Right.
And because we're not required, only a fool would actually tell us a reason, right? To give, right? I mean, no one does because they're not required to. And so, potentially you can't even really point to whether or not someone said something like that. So then really when in your question, Allison, you're really talking now about a subset of faculty that would be in the SUNY system on continuing appointment, tenured, more widely in higher ed. And what kind of due processes are built in the system. I don't know. I mean, you said that, I don't know. I mean, I can't speak for the whole SUNY system. I can speak for this campus, but I would say if it comes up, I guess I would be shocked if it comes up because there are other things, there are reasons that people do not get fired on this campus or for whatever that I'm like, well, that's probably way worse. So I mean, I don't really know what would you think, how they would point out to the enrollment issue versus the academic freedom versus other things that are not necessarily protected. And I think the whole misunderstanding of academic freedom is continuing appointment professors kind of think they are king or queen of their domain, and that domain is 220 Mahar Hall or whatever. And, that what they say goes. To find out that they're not, but it's no different than other disciplinary matters, I guess. I don't know, I'm having a hard time wrapping around context so I can think about a context. Throw out a context for me, Allison. You're muted, Allison. Throw out a context. Unmute.
Mike's been trying to jump in, so I'm going to let him.
I'm sorry, Mike.
That's okay. I was going to, thanks, Liz. And I was going to actually ask that question about non-tenure track faculty contingents and whether or not there's even kind of like nominal protection. It sounds like you're suggesting that there isn't.
Unless it's actually a protected class under Title VII of the Civil Rights Act, no.
So there are no guarantees. Like, I mean, I direct the first year writing program. One of our main charges, as far as I'm concerned, is to teach the evaluation of sources. And so, I would encourage faculty members to say some things about media sources, Fox News, which is a media source that lots of students have this great sort of personal allegiance to. And so I think it puts them in a position to have these kinds of disagreements with or to raise objections from students sort of on political and partisan grounds, if you trash Fox News as a source. So part-time faculty members have no, that would be to put them in a position again to generate some ill will among students. So part-time faculty members have no protection even sort of nominally in SUNY system?
Well,
Correct?
I mean, Mike, part of that depends on how you're defining protections, I guess, in this way, right? In the example you just gave, I would argue as provost or as a dean in this situation that faculty member is engaging in an information literacy exercise, broadly defined, right? And checking of sources and the quality of the source is critical in the writing process, right? Or in the research process that students go through. Doesn't mean they won't get criticized by a particular student, right? But if that type of if a student came forward and said, well, this person is criticizing me because I watch Fox News, okay, that's not why they're being criticized, right? They haven't shown the legitimacy of Fox or Newsmax or MSNBC, or depending on what side of the aisle you want to go on these things, right? And again, from a dean's perspective, I think, or a provost perspective, they are quote unquote protected, and we wouldn't automatically fire that person because of that situation. You know, I
Right,
think,
but you're talking about what you would do, and I'm actually saying our administrative representative here is a good actor. All right, so I'm not just saying that because he's sitting there, right? And you can't count on policy always
here,
working.
have a
because
bag
the-
of chips, thank you.
Because, you know, right, and so, yeah, so if I had good actors among the leadership that exists at Oswego, I could speak more confidently about that. But I think Allison's push is more general, and then what if you don't have good actors? You know, what if you have someone who hypothetically spends $38,000 on a sushi dinner, if you've read the Chronicle article?
Yeah, I saw that one too. But I guess thank you. I am a good actor, I think. Thank
But
you.
so
But I
I-
think the bigger issue is the context that you're working in also, right? You know, because I agree. And on the more general comment from or the context that Allison is providing, what I just said, I don't think would hold water every place in the country. Right. And particularly at every institution, you know, in the country, you know, and so you know, I have colleagues around the country that are in some difficult states right now, you know, and I thank my whatever I'm thanking every day about where you know where I'm working, you know. So you know, I again personally, I do think there is some responsibility, you know, for administration to make legitimate claims regarding the types of things that we're trying to teach, right? And around information literacy, around critical thinking, and that's again, maybe that makes me a good actor, but that's also part of the responsibility of higher education in more general terms. And again, that might be a bit Pollyannish.
Yeah, I mean, I mean, maybe a bit, I don't know if it's totally Pollyannish, but I think Michael's question is if, right? So if someone was actually upset, there was a critical mass of students that were upset, right? So critical mass of students with Fox News watching parents or whatever, calling the president's office, emailing, right? It's so unfair, indoctrination, blah, blah, you know the rule. And they think this person's trouble. We don't want this person teaching English 101 or 102 again. You know, for part-time faculty can be non-renewed without reason.
Yeah.
So that faculty will
That is
never be
true.
able to map non-renewal to what they did. They will never be able to do that because they'll ask the administration, why not? And they're like, you know, cause, or, you know, whatever, you know, or like, or they're gonna say, you know, under our contractual obligations, we decline to inform you and just inform you they were non-renewed as we are required by the labor agreement, right? With United.
But yes, exactly. That was my question. I mean, I have no doubt, Scott, that you and other local
Right.
administrators will be really supportive, you know, but I guess I did wonder about the extent to which any
Right.
kind of
And
language.
you wouldn't have standing under
Standing.
employment law.
Right.
Because the contract already says you're not entitled to a reason. The only person someone would have standing under employment law is potentially if the non-renewed is a protective class.
Yes.
And you could work that in. Now, all of a sudden you have remedy. But I would say, you know, in the other hypothetical case you're talking about, I mean, there's not even a legal remedy. There's not, it wouldn't even make it past a summary judge. You wouldn't even get an attorney probably to take that case if someone wanted to spend it, just because you would look at the agreement and say, it's completely at will. It's, you know, you could actually be non-renewed for wearing a New England Patriots tie. And, you know, good, right? But, you know, hey. Oh, I'm sorry. Do you like cheaters? Sorry. The pro-cheat lobby is offended at my time. So, and that is not academic freedom because men's formal wear is actually not part of it. So that would have been wrong if I would have done that in the class.
And so the ever increasing numbers of adjunct faculty at higher ed institutions shouldn't come as a surprise to anyone because it's a much more easily
Controlled, but it's also much
Yeah.
more flexible.
It's
Right.
cheaper.
You're not stuck
And
with,
cheaper,
you know,
yeah.
I have a bunch of tenured Russian professors and the Cold War ends,
There you go. Yeah.
right? I mean, in other words, that's, I think that was the driven model. I mean, cost savings, but it was also about, you know, as demand changes and ebbs and flows, you have different instructional needs.
And,
But
and
yeah,
it goes at, part of that goes at the, the difficulty of moving the higher ed ship, right? It just takes so long, right? So if you want to jump into something, in some areas, frankly, you jump in and you want to provide that program for 5 years, and then you've kind of saturated the market, and then there's no real need. It's hard to do that when you've got tenure faculty in that space. And again, I'm not suggesting we shouldn't have tenure faculty, but it is some of the reality of the business side, getting back to what you're talking about of
I mean, I
higher
would
ed.
say, yeah, in some sense, that academic freedom, the practical restriction, even if it's, de facto, if not de juris, right, was maybe it was a side effect of what I think was a primarily financial motivated labor contingency decision.
Now, Liz, when you mentioned, so is it only part-time? So you're
Well, it
talking-
would be
Any
contingent
contingent
faculty, so
faculty.
potentially
Yeah,
VAPs
VAPs as
also,
well, yeah.
VAPs, and lecturers at a certain amount of time, lecturers have additional protection, but in their early years, they do not. Non-renewal for tenure track faculty also does not carry, right? You
How
don't
much-
necessarily, you don't have to, right?
Don't have to give
How much
reason.
time,
Right.
Liz, how much time in, like, is there are there provisions for senior lecturers? I know there are in system.
Yeah, so around year 7, I think it's after 7 years, lecture protections kick in. One of the reasons, that administration was very helpful in moving VAPs to lecturers, like we pushed for it and they agreed. Number one, the VAP title, like, if you're there for 20 years, that's a real long visit and it's not a good title. And so, right, you're not really visiting for 20 years. And but the other reason is, we were pushing it too because we wanted those protections, because you can be a VAP for 20 years and you have no more protection than a VAP for 1 year. All right. So yeah. So those protections come in at specific points in time, but early on in those first 6 years or so, there's really no protections for faculty in terms of that reasons for non-renewals or things like that. Which is why it's important. I'm sorry, I know, Allison, you're biting, but I'm going to say this is why senior faculty have a particular responsibility to be obnoxious and loudmouth, and you're welcome.
I mean, I think to me, this just starts getting into a I am very uncomfortable with the kind of and this will get back to I have problems with any kind of invocation of structures don't matter, people matter, kind of explanation of a university. Structures matter deeply. I am in a world where I'm sort of at the front of trying to push people to do more civic work, and we're looking at trying to put a civic discourse in democracy, gen ed, right? I can't envision a world where a bunch of that labor in a bunch of departments doesn't go to classes taught by contingent faculty.
Right.
And
Yeah.
that is incredibly discomforting to me.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean,
Right?
that's,
And I think to
I don't think any of
to
us are
not
gonna
be
dispute
upfront
that
about
reality.
what that means is really unfortunate and unfair. Minimally, it is unfortunate and unfair.
Yeah, I mean, I guess if you came here for comfort, Allison, I'm sorry. There's chocolate.
It's not, no.
Chips, you got chips?
There's candy bars upstairs.
Questions that were in a desire to sort of say, people here will be good actors about this. I don't necessarily think we're pushing all the way through to the end of the conversation. And I think we need to.
Well, no, and I think we found out that our systems and institutions aren't as immune to bad actors as we would like to believe.
Yeah.
And as a little historical note, there was a case in your department back in 1981 where Michael Urban was terminated, was not given tenure because he had engaged in a union protest. He was also the campus union rep, but he was terminated by the president because he commented on the poor treatment of faculty by the union and was not renewed. He, of course, won a lawsuit and so forth, but it was an interesting
Well, I mean,
case.
our Richard Heiss was fired as department chair because he filed a union grievance about
Around the same time.
Yeah, around the same time.
Wow.
Yeah.
Because the
Really?
teaching load had gone from 9 hours to 12 hours on campus
Mhm.
at that point, and people were protesting the change in the terms and conditions of employment.
Yeah.
That president kept several lawyers busy, I'm just gonna say.
Well, yeah. She also had students dig up.
Oh,
Right,
good.
the asbestos,
Yeah.
right.
Yeah.
There's a lot of stories there. Yeah.
But now there is an award named after her,
I
so
learned a lot
in the
about
long
that.
run, it paid off.
No, it's not.
So we're technically 7 minutes over time. So I want to be sort of respectful of folks, and I know other folks need to hop off. So if folks need to hop off, please do. But if other folks have questions.
Okay,
I would leave you with this. The guardians of academic freedom have to be the most privileged and protected in this system.
Hmm.
Kind of references the last thing I just said. So, there are people with certain protections and privileges in this system, right? And there are those that are not. And the protected, can't be hiding behind a chair and hope things will get better.
okay, we'll stop the recording. Thank you.
Cool. Thanks, everybody.